Hey, how's it going? Are you ready for a spooky good mill-tastic time at your next Magic the Gathering game? I'm always ready for that kind of thing, with my blue-black mill deck. Alright, let's start by going over creatures. This is a 60-card deck, and 13 cards are creature cards. The mana-cheapest creatures I have in my deck are the Wights of Precinct Six. They cost 1 black and 1 generic mana. Their special ability gives them a +1/+1 counter for each creature in your opponent's graveyard. So once you've milled a decent portion of your opponent's deck, these guys can get pretty big. I have 4 of them in my deck. The next creature card I have, for the same converted mana price, are Dimir Infiltrators. They cost 1 black and 1 blue mana. Their special ability is that they're unblockable. They're a 1/3 and they make really good defenders, especially early on. And they can sneak by your enemy's defenses to deliver attacks. I have 3 of them in my deck. Okay, next up I have a non-modern card. So he's not available for play in a modern tournament. Just be aware. This little guy is the Riddlekeeper. He's a nasty little homunculus who will cost you 1 blue mana and 2 generic mana. He's a 1/4, and whenever a creature attacks you or a planeswalker you control, that creature's controller puts the top 2 cards of their library into their graveyard. So he's an excellent defense against swarms. Now onto the really big cards. First, there's the Consuming Aberration. This guy will cost you 1 blue mana, 1 black mana, and 3 generic mana, but he's well worth the price. He has power and toughness equal to the number of cards in your opponent's graveyard. And whenever you cast a spell, your opponent reveals cards from the top of his or her library until they have revealed a land card, and then they put all of those cards into their graveyard. He's a great attacker, he's a great defender, and whenever you do anything, your opponent mills. I have 2 of them in my deck. Next at bat is Nemesis of Reason. I have 1 of them in my deck. Nemesis of Reason will cost you 1 black mana, 1 blue mana, and 3 generic mana. Whenever Nemesis of Reason attacks, the defending player puts the top 10 cards of their library into their graveyard. Doesn't even need to do damage, just when he attacks. He's a 3/7. The final creature in my deck is Szadek, Lord of Secrets. He's a legendary vampire. He has flying, and he's going to cost you a very handsome 2 black mana, 2 blue mana, and 3 generic mana. So, let me talk about his special ability. When he deals combat damage to a player, instead, put that many +1/+1 counters on Szadek, and then the player puts that many cards from the top of his library into the graveyard. He starts as a 5/5, so that first hit, they'll mill 5. Second hit, mill 10. Hit after that, mill 20. So on and so forth. Alright, now let's look at the enchantments in this deck. There are 8 of them. First up is Skeletal Grimace. This costs 1 black and 1 generic mana. The enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has tap 1 black, regenerate. So, if you can attach this to something like Nemesis of Reason, you never need to worry about him getting killed. As long as you have 1 black mana untapped, he's fine. Also, the artwork is really great. I have 4 of them in my deck. The next enchantment is Sphinx's Tutelage. This Sphinx will cost you 1 blue mana and 2 generic mana. When he's out, whenever you draw a card, your opponent puts the top 2 cards from his library into his graveyard. If they're both non-land cards that share a color, they repeat the process, so they put 2 more cards into their graveyard. And the last thing about Sphinx's Tutelage is that it can proc itself. If you tap 1 blue mana and 5 generic mana, you can draw a card and make them repeat the process. I have 1 of those in my deck. The final type of enchantment card I have is Claustrophobia. This is a great way to shut down troublesome things which are attacking you. It will cost you 2 blue mana and 1 generic mana. When Claustrophobia enters the battlefield, tap Enchanted Creature. Enchanted Creature does not untap during its controller's next untap step. I have 3 of them in my deck. Now on to the next card category, Instants. I have 11 of them. First up is a fun little one called Dream Twist. When you play Dream Twist, target player puts the top 3 cards of his library into his graveyard. This will cost you 1 blue mana. And a fun extra is that you can flash it back, that means you play it again, for 1 blue mana and 1 generic mana, and then you exile it. So when it's all said and done, they've milled 6 cards. I have 2 of them in my deck. Next up, Thought Scour. This will cost you 1 blue mana. This instant makes your opponent mill 2 cards from the top of their library, and you draw a card. Yes, this does proc Sphinx's Tutelage. I have 4 of them in my deck. Now for my spell counter, Psychic Strike. This is more expensive than Counterspell, but it makes the mill in the process. It costs 1 black mana, 1 blue mana, and 1 generic mana. This works like Counterspell, but they mill 2 cards. I have 3 of them in my deck. The final type of instant that I have is Grisly Spectacle. This is a little on the pricey side at 2 black mana and 2 generic mana. This destroys target non-artifact creature, and its controller puts a number of cards equal to that creature's power from the top of their library into their graveyard. So if you're playing against someone who's got a big 10-10 or something, just kill that and make them mill 10 cards. I have 2 of them in my deck. Alright, now on to sorceries. I have 9 of them in my deck. First up is Mind Sculpt. This is a fantastic mill card. It costs 1 blue and 1 generic. Target opponent puts the top 7 cards from their library into their graveyard. I have 4 of them in my deck. Next, I have Paranoid Delusion. This will cost you 1 black mana and 1 blue mana. When it's played, target opponent puts the top 3 cards of their library into their graveyard, and you siphon it onto a creature. This really should go on the Dimir Infiltrators, by the way. What this means is, whenever that creature deals combat damage to a player, they mill 3 cards. I have 2 of them in my deck. Next up, I have the only other type of non-modern card in my deck, a card called Mind Funeral. Mind Funeral will cost you 1 black mana, 1 blue mana, and 1 generic mana. When played, target opponent puts cards from the top of their library into their graveyard until they've revealed 4 lands. I have 2 of them in my deck. My final sorcery is a card called Startled Awake. This card is fantastic. It costs 2 blue mana and 2 generic mana. When played, your opponent puts the top 13 cards of their library into their graveyard. And as a lovely additional feature, for 2 blue mana and 3 generic mana, you can transform Startled Awake into Persistent Nightmare. This is a 1/1 with Skulk. Now, whenever Persistent Nightmare deals combat damage to a player, you return it to your hand, so you can mill them for 13 more cards. Isn't that nice? Finally, let's talk land. My deck has 19 land cards. It has 6 black mana, 6 blue mana. The rest is non-standard. Now, you really do need 2 colored mana for any dual-color deck. The first type of non-standard mana I have is a thing called Dismal Backwater. This counts as either 1 blue mana or 1 black mana, and when you play it, you gain 1 life. However, it has a drawback: it enters the battlefield tapped, which means you can't use it until next turn. Another fun non-standard land I have is the Duskmantle House of Shadow. This gives you 1 generic mana, but if you tap 1 blue mana and 1 black mana, you can make your opponent mill the top card of their library. The final type of non-standard land I have is the Dimir Aqueduct. And when you play it, you take a land from the field of play and put it back into your hand. This might seem like a disadvantage, but if you have Dismal Backwater, it lets you gain an additional health. And the great thing about Dimir Aqueduct is that it produces 1 blue mana and 1 black mana, so it's a 2-for-1. Now before I go, I need to tell you about the kind of decks that this deck simply can't beat. Anything which gives an opponent an ability to shuffle their graveyard back into their library, you pretty much can't beat them. Or you're going to have a lot of trouble and you're going to be relying a lot on luck. A friend of mine plays a green deck with a card called Gaia's Blessing. Pretty much can't beat him, not with this deck. Thank you for watching my blue-black mill deck build for Magic the Gathering. Now if you're interested in character builds, class analysis, and other videos about Dungeons & Dragons and Pathfinder, check out D6 Damage right here on YouTube. Thank you for watching.